General Hospital spoilers reveal that Curtis has always been a man who trusts his instincts, and lately, those instincts have been sounding the alarm louder than ever. What began as a quiet concern for Portia has transformed into a full-fledged, rising dread, because he no longer sees Drew as just a man coping with heartbreak. He sees him as a threat. A growing, unstable force, driven by obsession and humiliation, slowly spiraling out of control. And Portia, brilliant, composed, and fiercely protective, is suddenly not the confident woman Curtis once knew, but a target. She moves differently now. She hesitates more often. There's a tiredness in her eyes, a heaviness in her voice. Curtis recognizes the signs. She's not just overwhelmed, she's afraid. And she's trying to hide it. But he won't let her fight this alone. The unraveling began after Willow's abrupt departure from the wedding, when she fled before saying, "I do," leaving Drew shattered in front of the entire town. From that moment on, Drew's public persona began to peel away, layer by layer, revealing a man not just devastated, but obsessed with control, reputation, and vindication. In his mind, someone had to be blamed. Willow was gone, emotionally out of reach. But Portia? Portia had spoken with Willow. She had seen her alone in the hours leading up to the ceremony. She had offered words of wisdom, perhaps even doubt. And in Drew's mind, that made her complicit. What began as subtle comments and condescending smiles has now evolved into quiet intimidation. Drew shows up unannounced at the hospital, questioning decisions. Lingering in the corridors near Portia's office, asking pointed questions to nurses and administrative staff under the pretense of concern. He's building a narrative, one that casts Portia as unstable, as someone interfering in personal matters she had no business touching. He doesn't accuse her directly, but his implications are venomous. And Curtis sees exactly what's happening. Drew is manipulating perception. He's isolating Portia, undermining her credibility, and planting seeds of doubt wherever he can. Not because he truly believes she ruined his wedding, but because he needs someone to hold responsible. Someone to punish. And in his distorted view of justice, Portia is the perfect candidate. Curtis refuses to let it happen. Despite their own complicated past, he knows Portia's character. He knows her loyalty, her discipline, and the way she sacrifices without question. She doesn't deserve to be vilified by a man unraveling from his own guilt and shame. So Curtis begins to act. At first quietly. Checking in more often, walking her to her car at night, offering a calm presence in the spaces Drew keeps trying to invade. But as the pressure mounts and Drew's behavior escalates, Curtis realizes this can't be handled with subtlety anymore. He begins speaking with security at the hospital, flagging Drew's behavior as inappropriate and concerning. He has conversations with Elizabeth, with Liesel, even with Anna, asking if they've seen signs, if they too sense that something isn't right with Drew. And they have. They've noticed the coldness, the erratic tone, the way he seems less concerned with healing and more focused on power and control. Portia, at first, tries to dismiss it. She insists she's fine, that Drew is just struggling and needs space. But as Curtis begins revealing what others have observed, how often Drew is lingering near her schedule, how his tone has turned threatening, she begins to accept what she didn't want to face. She's being watched. Hunted, even. And worse, she's beginning to feel trapped by it. Because Drew isn't just targeting her career, he's trying to erode her stability, piece by piece, by using her reputation, her relationships, and her silence against her. Curtis won't let that happen. He begins coordinating a more structured defense, legal consultation in case Drew takes things further, witness statements about his erratic behavior, even surveillance reviews at the hospital. This isn't just about protection anymore. It's about preparing for war. Because the version of Drew now stalking Port Charles isn't just a wounded man. He's a man sharpening his pain into a weapon. And Portia is directly in the line of fire. But things take a turn when Drew starts making veiled threats not just toward Portia's position at the hospital, but toward her relationship with Trina. He brings up her judgment. He questions her decisions about patient confidentiality. He begins suggesting, to anyone who will listen, that Portia's emotional connections have clouded her ability to remain impartial in the workplace. It's subtle. Tactical. But it's poison. And Portia, who has worked so hard to maintain respect and authority, finds herself suddenly fighting for her credibility. Not because she's failed, but because Drew has chosen her as his scapegoat. Curtis becomes her shield, more publicly now. He stands beside her at hospital meetings. He steps in when Drew appears unannounced. He speaks to legal counsel, demanding that any further contact from Drew be formalized. But with every step forward, the situation grows more volatile. Drew becomes bolder, more aggressive in his undertones. His obsession has overtaken him completely, and what started as grief has now fermented into something dangerous. And beneath all of it, Curtis knows something deeper is happening, something connected to Drew's position, his access, and possibly even his ties to hidden elements of the WSB. Drew's behavior may not be just emotional fallout. It might be part of a calculated descent into a darker version of himself, one driven by vengeance, secrets, and the need to regain dominance over the people he believes took everything from him. Portia is just the beginning. If no one stops him, others may follow. Curtis knows this is no longer just about Drew and Portia. It's about the safety of Port Charles itself. It's about the unchecked power of a man unraveling in silence, backed by years of access, money, and reputation. And if Drew isn't confronted soon, truly confronted, he may become more than a threat. He may become a force of destruction. The battle lines are drawn now. Portia is no longer just a doctor or a mother, she's a target standing in the path of a man who has nothing left to lose. And Curtis, once again, is the only one willing to stand between her and the storm. But this time, he's not just defending her from scandal. He's defending her from a man who's one step away from becoming something no one saw coming. And that's why the battle about to unfold may be the most dangerous Curtis has ever faced, because it's no longer just about love or redemption. It's about survival. And survival always comes with a price. Curtis had spent months caught in a storm of uncertainty, frustration, and guilt. What began as concern for Portia had slowly evolved into a consuming obsession. The woman he loved was no longer the calm, composed doctor he once admired. She was shrinking, bending under a force that none of them fully understood, one that had a name, Drew. At first, Curtis couldn't quite articulate what was wrong. Drew, to many, still carried the public image of a wounded hero, a man who had returned from the dead and reclaimed his life. But behind that mask was something insidious. The closer Curtis looked, the more he realized that Drew wasn't just acting strangely, he was manipulating, isolating, erasing. And Portia, always strong-willed, had become one of his targets. Curtis, once a voice of reason in Port Charles, had started unraveling in private. The sense of helplessness morphed into late-night pacing, whispered phone calls, and a simmering rage that he no longer tried to hide. His temper flared at minor provocations. He lashed out at friends who told him he was imagining things. He stopped sleeping, stopped smiling, and most of all, he stopped pretending. What mattered now was saving Portia, from Drew, from the shadows that seemed to grow with every passing day, and from whatever secret was eating her alive. But he couldn't do it alone. And that's when Stella stepped back into the picture. Stella had been away for some time, visiting old friends and chasing ghosts of her own. But the minute she returned to Port Charles and saw Curtis's face, she knew something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just grief. It was something colder. Something darker. Stella had always been the compass of the family, the one who anchored them when emotion threatened to swallow reason. But as she began to investigate Drew in her own quiet way, she uncovered things that chilled her to the bone. Hidden financial transactions tied to Black Ops funding. A trail of erased medical records. Confidential files from Drew's time in WSB that were supposedly destroyed, yet now mysteriously accessed. And then came the final piece. A packet of information delivered anonymously to Stella's mailbox, sealed with a symbol she recognized from decades ago. It contained documents, some real, some likely forged, but all painting the same picture. Drew was part of something larger, darker, and far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. It was a network of cover-ups, of manipulated identities, of emotional conditioning masked as therapy. Drew's control over Portia wasn't just emotional, it was clinical, strategic, even scientific. As Stella shared the findings with Curtis, a chilling idea began to take root. This wasn't just about Portia anymore. Drew had returned to Port Charles with an agenda. And somewhere buried in that agenda was the desire to rewrite his past, and perhaps erase those who threatened it. And now, with Willow's wedding having imploded, with Britt possibly alive, and with Jason chasing leads across Europe, the puzzle was snapping into place. Curtis, now consumed by this truth, no longer saw boundaries. He began to plot, not just emotionally but tactically. Stella, ever cautious, urged patience. But she too was slipping into dangerous waters. Because deep in her soul, she believed this wasn't just Drew's doing. Someone was enabling him, possibly someone still within the WSB or GH administration. Perhaps even a name they all trusted. Portia, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting. Drew, once gentle and attentive, had become erratic. His protectiveness turned controlling. He began speaking of destiny, of shared futures no matter what others said. He grew paranoid, accusing her of being manipulated by Curtis, by Stella, even by Anna. He checked her phone, questioned her schedule, and slowly isolated her from Trina. When Portia pushed back, Drew broke down, not in tears, but in cold, terrifying silence. That silence said everything. And then, in a moment that changed everything, Curtis followed Drew to an old storage unit on the edge of town. What he found inside wasn't illegal, but it was enough to prove Drew was hiding something serious. Medical files, photos, surveillance notes. There were even transcripts of conversations between Portia and her colleagues, all catalogued neatly, obsessively. When Curtis confronted him, Drew merely smiled and said, "It's for her protection. You wouldn't understand." The tension escalated. Stella urged Curtis to leak the files to Anna, to expose Drew publicly. But Curtis wasn't ready. He wanted Drew to know what fear felt like. He wanted to dismantle him piece by piece. But this desire for revenge began to blur with obsession, and soon, Curtis could no longer distinguish between his mission and his anger. He stopped caring about legal consequences. He began to consider dangerous alliances. Stella, meanwhile, uncovered something else, a link between Drew and a mysterious European clinic where psychological conditioning was rumored to have been used on former agents. She feared Drew had undergone treatment there, that what they were dealing with wasn't just calculated, it was engineered. And worse, that Drew himself might not know where his conditioning ended and his real personality began. If true, this meant he could be both victim and perpetrator. It meant he could snap at any moment. Then came the moment that would set everything on fire. Drew disappeared with Portia. For 2 days, no one knew where they were. Trina panicked. Curtis lost his mind. Stella activated old WSB contacts. And finally, they were found, in a remote cabin Drew had outfitted for emergencies. He claimed they had gone to reconnect. But Portia's body language told a different story. She was pale, distant, trembling. And she didn't say a word. Curtis brought her home, but something had changed. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She watched Drew from her window every night. And when he sent her a bouquet of lilies and a note that read, "You'll see the truth soon," Portia began to cry, not from fear, but from helplessness. That night, Curtis made a vow. Drew would never hurt anyone again. What he didn't know was that Stella had gone a step further. She had sent a dossier to someone else, someone in the shadows who had once hunted Drew and now had a reason to do it again. Someone who didn't ask questions, didn't need proof, only motive. The fuse had been lit. And Port Charles was about to burn. Stella had grown tired of silence, of watching the people she loved unravel in the name of loyalty, pride, or outdated vows that no longer meant anything. Her eyes had been wide open for months, observing the slow decay of Curtis's marriage, watching the shadows lengthen between him and Portia. Until their home no longer resembled a sanctuary but a prison built on guilt, mistrust, and denial. Portia, once a woman of admirable resolve, had become entrenched in a dynamic that weakened her dignity. And Curtis, once a pillar of strength, was now adrift, erratic, consumed by paranoia about Drew and unable to discern friend from foe. Stella understood this collapse better than anyone, because she saw it coming long before they admitted it to themselves. She saw how Portia, beneath her composed facade, was grasping at something that no longer existed. The love between them had decayed into obligation, and that obligation had turned into emotional hostage-taking. But Curtis couldn't admit it. He clung to what remained because he didn't know how to live without the illusion. Stella, however, was no longer interested in illusions. She had been part of this family for too long to pretend things could be fixed. She knew that Portia's presence wasn't healing Curtis, it was haunting him. And so she made a decision that would change everything. Stella began orchestrating a quiet plan, one that would liberate Portia and dismantle Curtis's delusions without creating public chaos. Her first step was emotional disarmament. She took Portia aside and gently, but firmly, began to lay the groundwork. No longer cloaked in sentimentality, her words were sharp and direct. Portia was doing more harm than good. She told her that love, when poisoned by secrecy and control, ceased to be love, it became a weapon. Stella asked Portia why she stayed. And when the younger woman couldn't provide an honest answer, Stella knew she was right. She then started to maneuver behind the scenes. She met with legal advisors, explored fast-track divorce procedures, and even found a discreet therapist for Portia to speak to, one not affiliated with the hospital or Curtis's orbit. She didn't tell Portia all of this at once. But she made sure the exits were available should Portia choose to walk through them. But Portia hesitated, and Stella knew why. It wasn't about love anymore, it was about guilt. About not wanting to be the woman who destroyed Curtis's recovery. Portia still carried the burden of Trina's secret. Of being the reason Curtis didn't know the truth about his own child until it was too late. She believed she owed him something, that staying was a penance. But Stella refused to let her niece-in-law live in a state of perpetual atonement. What had once been compassion from Portia had become a kind of martyrdom. And Stella would not stand by and let it consume both of them. She reminded Portia that guilt is a poor architect for any future and that freedom, though frightening, was the only honest path left. At the same time, Stella began confronting Curtis. She didn't speak to him with pity or sympathy. She confronted his behaviors head-on. She told him he had become erratic. That he was using Drew as a scapegoat for his own internal collapse, and that the anger he reserved for Portia wasn't about her deception, it was about his own inability to forgive. She told him to stop hiding behind righteous fury and start making decisions. But Curtis, wounded and unstable, resisted. He lashed out, turned defensive, and claimed everyone was turning against him. This only confirmed Stella's worst fears: the marriage was no longer salvageable. It was, in fact, dangerous. So she turned her attention back to Portia and escalated her strategy. She suggested Portia not wait. She advised her to begin the legal process quietly and to take time away from Curtis, not as a punishment, but as a necessity for survival. Portia, still reluctant, feared public backlash, feared how Trina would react, feared that ending the marriage would look like abandoning Curtis at his worst. But Stella silenced her with one piercing truth. Staying was not saving him. Staying was enabling him. And then Stella dropped her final bombshell. She revealed that she had proof, documents she'd uncovered, that Drew had manipulated hospital board members to protect Curtis's role in a recent scandal involving stolen medical data. Curtis didn't even know he was being used, but Drew was exploiting his reputation to mask illegal activities. And Portia, by proximity, was at risk. Stella warned her that the deeper Curtis got entangled with Drew's criminal web, the more exposed Portia would be. That, more than anything, shook her. For the first time, Portia saw not just a broken marriage, but a path to personal ruin. Still, the decision tore at her. But Stella pushed harder. She promised to stand by her, to shield her from backlash. To help Trina understand. She even offered to help Portia find new work if the hospital politics turned against her. Stella had prepared for every consequence. Because to her, this was no longer a negotiation, it was a rescue mission. In the end, Stella wasn't driven by bitterness or revenge. She was driven by clarity. Love, when it festers unacknowledged, turns into a weapon. And Curtis and Portia were both bleeding from it. Stella would not let that continue. And as Portia stood on the precipice of ending her marriage, Stella stood beside her. Not just as a family member, but as a liberator. The storm was coming. The reckoning was near. But this time, Stella wouldn't let it bury them. She would walk through it, torch in hand. Ready to burn away everything that no longer served the truth. Curtis may appear on the surface to be gaining ground, maneuvering through the chaos with calculated determination. But beneath that composed facade lies a man unraveling. His every move is now fueled by the illusion of control, by the belief that he can somehow salvage his dignity, protect Portia, and restore the life he once had. But what Curtis fails to grasp is that the damage has already taken root, quietly, corrosively, and it is not something that can be erased with mere victories. Each confrontation, each secret uncovered, each accusation thrown at Drew, at Portia, at even Stella, chips away at the identity he once prided himself on. What he sees as boldness, others recognize as desperation. What he calls strategy is, in truth, obsession. And the worst part is, Curtis is blind to it. His war against Drew is no longer about justice or the truth. It's personal, almost primal, driven by jealousy, betrayal, and a gnawing fear that he has become irrelevant. Watching Portia withdraw, watching her eyes go cold and distant, has broken something in him, though he won't admit it. He tells himself he's fighting for her, for their marriage, but every action says otherwise. Portia is no longer looking at him as a partner but as a threat. And Curtis doesn't see it. Or maybe he does, and simply refuses to accept it. Because to accept it would mean acknowledging that his marriage is falling apart not because of Drew, but because of the man he has become. The more he pushes, the more he loses. Trina no longer seeks his advice. The community that once respected him keeps their distance. Stella, who once believed he could rise above the legacy of betrayal that haunted their family, now watches him with quiet disappointment. She knows, perhaps better than anyone, that Curtis isn't thinking clearly. She's tried to intervene, to guide him back from the edge. But Curtis meets every concern with defensiveness and denial. The damage is no longer theoretical. It is active. It is visible. And it is devastating. Behind closed doors. Curtis is haunted by sleepless nights, his mind plagued with visions of Portia walking away, of Drew standing victorious, of Stella's judgmental silence. He paces like a man caged, checking messages. Watching shadows, analyzing every word spoken to him as if it holds a secret he must decode. He's losing time, forgetting appointments, lashing out at allies. The toll on his mind is immense. But pride and paranoia won't let him acknowledge it. He tells himself it's just a rough patch, that things will make sense once he gets proof, once Drew is exposed. But there is no singular moment of redemption waiting for him. The proof he seeks is a phantom, and the cost of chasing it has already bled him dry. Meanwhile, the damage spreads. His relationship with Portia has become a war zone, with silence acting as the only ceasefire. They speak in half sentences, share space like strangers. She no longer touches him. She no longer trusts him. Her eyes flicker with exhaustion, not love. She is done fighting for him, even if she hasn't said it aloud yet. Curtis can feel it in the way she doesn't ask where he's going or when he'll be back. He can feel it in how she pulls away from his attempts at intimacy. Every moment they share now is a reminder of what has been lost. Even worse, Curtis has begun to isolate himself emotionally, becoming more erratic, more unpredictable. He accuses people of betrayal without evidence, reads into casual conversations as if every word is a coded attack. He believes that people are whispering about him, behind his back. In hospital corridors, in private text messages he isn't a part of. His need to be right, to be vindicated, has become a sickness. His once sharp instincts are clouded by rage and resentment. And the people who once loved him now walk on eggshells, afraid to say the wrong thing. Curtis may still wear the clothes of a leader, of a man in control, but his soul is splintered. His heart is weighed down by bitterness and regret, even if he doesn't realize it. He has lost his way, not because someone led him astray, but because he allowed himself to become consumed by the idea that he had to win at all costs. But victory that demands the destruction of everything you love is no victory at all. It's a slow suicide dressed in the illusion of purpose. Stella, watching quietly from the sidelines, knows the truth. She sees it all, the heartbreak, the descent. The self-inflicted wounds Curtis refuses to acknowledge. She's tried to intervene, but now she's begun to accept that Curtis may have to lose everything before he realizes what he's become. She's even started preparing herself to pick up the pieces, not for Curtis, but for Portia and Trina, for the family that's splintering under the weight of one man's unyielding pride. And Curtis? He continues, unaware or unwilling to stop, certain that he's just one step away from proving himself, from reclaiming his life. But in reality, he's already lost it. What remains now is not about victory or vindication, it's about survival. And the question no one dares to ask is, when Curtis finally realizes the truth, will there be anything left of him to save?